It's my honor this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, Beata Tsosie-Peña, Organizational Director for Breath of My Heart, Birthplace, and co-creator of Española Healing Foods Oasis and Seed Library. Beata Tsosie-Peña is from Santa Clara, Pueblo, and El Rito, New Mexico. She's a mother, poet, advocate, seed keeper, and is a certified educator in birth work and in Indigenous Sustainable Design, permaculture. She's currently helping to support the traditional Native American Farmers Association and Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute. She's been working to address impacts and advocate for environmental and reproductive health and justice and food and seed sovereignty for over a decade. Breath of My Heart Birthplace is a member of the New Mexico Food and Seed Sovereignty Alliance, Communities for Clean Water, and the Frack Off Greater Chaco Coalition. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Beata, I will pass to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Sengitamu. Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Kha'p'o Owingeh. I hope that you're having your good day where you are, that your families are well. Just want to give thanks for this day and ask for blessings and healing for all those in our families who are sick, and send you all just lots of love this morning, wherever you are. Really excited to be here, talk about my favorite thing, which is our seed relatives. So I'm going to just start with a PowerPoint, and I'm open to any suggestions or comments from those. If we have time at the end, you can always feel free to reach out to me outside of this conference as well. Let me share my screen right away. Umbiat Gindi, with your respect, now Huahiwop Ovi, ne Kha'p'o Owingeh Omu, ne ke atoa amu. My name is Beata. I'm from Kha'p'o Owingeh, Santa Clara, Pueblo, northern New Mexico. I've been so blessed to just be born into what I've been born into and to do the work. It's a sacred calling working with these relatives. What I want to ground us in is just kind of the intersectionality of this work, thinking about who we need to center when it comes to things like seeds or our environment. Because as a Tewa woman, I'm very conscious of the role that I play in my community as a caregiver. You know, we all have a lot of titles and hats, but ultimately it's to pass on the knowledge that was passed on to me and think about how we can shift and transform this culture of violence into a more peaceful existence, to restore the pristine nature of our earth. And so what we've really started to put forth in our advocacy for a clean environment, and what I'm talking about around food and seed sovereignty today, we can't work with seeds in a silo. We need clean air, we need clean water, clean soil, and healthy bodies. And that's where the foundation of our food systems are. And so I want you to really start to shift in your minds and your hearts and your spirits. How do we center Indigenous pregnant families in the work that you all do and that we do collectively? How do we center the spiritual, physical, cultural, living relations of Indigenous peoples? You know, I don't like to use the word property, but when you think about seeds, that's the opposite of how we view being a living part of our ecologies. I show this picture. This is when I was pregnant with my youngest son, who's now 10, so it's an older photo. It's by our river, who we know as Kha'p'o Owingeh. I've just been so blessed to learn from the generations before me and my elders and the matriarchs from my community. So nothing that I know or speak of, it was all taught to me from my elders. It was all taught to me from the natural world. And we have our Indigenous ways of knowing a lot because we're blessed to still be in our ancestral homelands. A lot of Native and Indigenous peoples were forcefully relocated through years of colonial genocide and relocation. And so that has to shift. We need to really look at the land back movement. We need to look at what is our first environment, you know, and water is our first environment. In one pregnancy, 3 generations are held as one. And this is teachings I learned from Mohawk midwife Goji Cook. When I talk about intersections of our environment, and we can think of people as seeds and how we come into beingness as well. When I talk about centering Indigenous pregnant families, those are who are most vulnerable to toxicity in our environment. It's a sensitive time. And so when 3 generations are held, what we mean by that is when my daughters were born, they were born with all of the eggs that they're going to carry for the rest of their lifetime. So anything that they experience in that first environment of our womb waters, it is impacting 3 generations at once. And so it's really serious what Indigenous communities are facing and what humanity is facing on this planet. And so it's important that we're grounded in our strengths and ancestral knowledge. Think about what my teachers are always asked that question, what is a seed? And it's not as simple a question as you think. You know, it can be like so many things. We could probably start a group poem and this, like, what is a seed? And everyone put some words in. But it really is this continuance of a spiritual connection that roots us in our home place, that roots us in our survival and our connection, genetic connection to place as a living part of our ecologies, where we have co-evolved with these relatives over very long periods of time. And our food systems are the first target of colonial violence. Always the first weapon is to attack our food systems to try to weaken a people. We're still reeling from these impacts in many communities and trying to restore these connections and our health and wellness with food as medicine. So it's an act of resistance to help take care of these beings and these givers of life for humanity. And it's one of our greatest strengths as Indigenous and land-based peoples. And so thinking about those intersections of environmental and reproductive health, you know, where I live, we're on the front lines of a lot of really serious issues. In my backyard, 20 minutes away is Los Alamos National Laboratories, which is the production end of nuclear colonialism in our country. And the toxins that get released into our environment, a lot of them from legacy waste when these labs were unregulated, they're some of the only ones that can cross placental boundaries. So again, how do we center Navat Oijia, land worker mother? We have extraction in our communities. We're constantly having to be on the lookout and defending our traditional heirloom seeds from genetic engineering. We're still trying to educate the people and have access to foods that are not industrial farmed, that are not chemically laden. We're trying to move out of this culture of allowable harm into the precautionary principle of doing no harm, and then you're allowed to set up your industry. And if Navatoijia is the standard for protection in our environmental considerations and our foods considerations, any issue, everybody will be protected. And why we center Navatoijia, we're thinking about nuclear colonialism, is that women are twice as likely to get cancer as a man from the same dose of radiation. Infants are 75% as likely. But yet we're still dealing with so much scientific and medical racism that instead of centering Navatoijia, centers an adult white male as the baseline for a lot of environmental regulations. There's a lot of disparities that we can talk about in scientific communities in regards to institutional and systemic racism. And because we're Indigenous and land-based peoples, we are at an increased risk for cumulative and multiple exposures over long periods of time. We still hunt, we fish, we gather, we get our own food, our medicines, we have seasonal harvesting all year long. We have a sole source aquifer, which means that more than half of the population in our state depends on that aquifer for their water needs. We gather clays for our dishes, for our potteries. We're outdoors for longer periods of time. We're harvesting rainwater. You know, we're still eating a lot of our food from our gardens, game, all those things that can set us up, that at one point is our strength, but also can set us up for increased exposure in our bodies. This is in our sacred mountains, in the western part of our sacred mountains. This is a nuclear waste dump at our ancestral site, Sankawi. known as Area G. There's over 35,000 barrels of mixed radioactive waste and above ground in those like tents there that you see here, and below ground in unlined dirt pits. So that waste is going to outlive the container it's in. And you got to understand the Pajarito Plateau, where these labs, military labs, are located. It's part of the larger Jemez Plateau, which is a dormant supervolcano. So there's fault lines. The geology is very porous, and they're on top of our watershed. So we are downwind, downstream, and it's very concerning what it means as land-based peoples. There's the global issues around our other ecologies, Pacific Ocean. Like that photo is a Fukushima Daiichi. Tritium going into our Pacific. This site down here is a groundwater plume contamination of hexavalent chromium, perchlorate, and RDX. That is a 1 mile long, 3 mile wide plume in our groundwater from when the labs were unregulated and they were just dumping everything in our canyons. Fracking, we have tens of thousands of fracking wells in our communities. You know, we can't talk about food and seed sovereignty without holding these things together, because Indigenous people have been holding them. We're tired and we need help and support in shifting the power dynamics of how these lands are managed and return them to the original caregivers. And so we have this environmental violences, and that was naming a few. I could talk about those issues a lot more in depth. And so again, thinking about being strong in our ancestral strengths as peoples. And so we go lean into that. That's the energy that I want to feed in my family and with my life. So despite 3 waves of colonial violence, these things were passed on to me. We can still go to our ancient gardens and see how they're working to get that extra little bit of water, and how they're greener than other places. When we go harvest our wild foods and seeds, we take care of those places and give them some care. We're not passive participants in our ecologies these days. We're still very much active caregivers. We still have that spiritual communion with our non-human relatives. And so that was where we put intention into things like community gardens and restoration projects. This is the Española Healing Foods Oasis in its early days. You can see after one rain event, that Indigenous technology still holds true. And this is a dry land rainwater garden with edible medicinal herbal plants, outdoor educational space, so many teachings. And I always say the garden is the intersection for all of the social justice issues. Here's kind of a before after photo of that project. This was during my time with the local nonprofit Tewa Women United. I encourage everyone to look them up and support them. Have a lot of love for that organization. Yeah, this was a hot spot, an eyesore for 20 years on this very steep slope behind Española City Hall. It was when I was learning about Indigenous Sustainable Design that we witnessed a rain event there and all the water that was being passed down. It's interesting how also because of colonial forces that the way we think about landscapes, and here in the Southwest, how just kind of that attitude of wanting to divert water away from a site kind of came here also, when actually like you really want to hold that water and recharge the land and slow down its pathway back to the rivers. And so that's what's possible. And you can see this is probably a 5-year difference in these photos of just giving love and care to 2.5 acre site for a few years, with a huge community effort. Thousands of hours of volunteers from the community, collaborations with other orgs in the community. So really community-led grassroots projects that center Indigenous ways of knowing and the peoples. And this is what we can do. This is what we can do for our earth. At this garden, I've worked with my friend and colleague, Caitlin Bryson, who's an artist and mycologist. And again, in response to the environmental issues, we started doing a series of myco and bioremediation workshops. So when we talk about these really hard kind of environmental impacts, it's important to give the people solutions and hopefulness. And so all these youth at this workshop, they all submitted public comment on that hexavalent chromium plume that I was mentioned. And then they went and buried about 40 oyster mushroom bricks in the topsoil of the AHFO, which is the first layer of the parking lot water that it's harvesting, which we would call an urban watershed. Oyster mushrooms are known to digest oil and gas byproducts. This is really exciting stuff, and it is grounded, again, in those ways of knowing and in those ways that we're supposed to be in living relation with our environment. This is another community field at the Española Farmers Market that we stewarded for a long time, used it as a seed garden to grow out seeds and other garden projects. You can see way in the back is our Western Mountain Sikamuping, which marks the western edge of our Tewa territories. And that's where this water comes down from that you see in this field. And so it's really difficult to still live in relation to our ancestral lands and those boundaries between our sacred mountains, and then to have it checkerboarded between BLM land and federal land and private land and navigating water rights. There's just so many complex issues we could get into about water as well. But this is really has been life in our valley forever. And we used combinations of ditch irrigation and dryland farming and harvesting our wild food systems. And that's what made up our food systems in my community. And now a lot of that it's kind of flipped to being really dependent on ditch systems, acequia irrigation, because we have these industries in our backyard of nuclear weapons production. We had a intern one year that did find exceedance levels of RDX and perchlorates in the soil. RDX can only come from high explosives. It's water soluble. And when they're open or detonating these bombs that either they're saying they're too old to transport, so that's how they dispose of them, is through open air detonation, or they do demonstrations for military and others. These are all open, like on top of those mesas I was showing earlier. We hear the rumblings from these explosions all the time. It's very traumatic. It's in our fields, and this is one field out of thousands that was sampled. And so even the accountability and the burden of proof of harm still falls on our people to have to prove that harm is happening. And often they only have to test and sample the immediate surroundings of these labs, when really it's hundreds of miles of a radius from these facilities. And so my friend Caitlin made this beautiful pillow and we had some ceremony and prayer, and a small group of us that buried this pillow inoculated with turkey tails, which can break down RDX and change it into nitrogen, which is food for plants. I know that now that we know what we're dealing with, we know RDX accumulates in the leafy greens of plants. So in this field, maybe we wanted to plant more fruit bearing and not like lettuce and kale and things like that. Maybe we want to do a couple years of sunflowers and amaranth to draw things out of the soil. There's a lot that I would rather know what I'm working with than not know. And I wonder if some farmers do want to know. Maybe that threatens their organic certification. These are long-lasting impacts that there needs to be justice. We know that when our resources are restored to us, they can get cleaned, they can get remediated. We're not going to abandon contaminated sites just because they've been harmed. Just like we wouldn't abandon a relative in a hospital that was sick. This is another project in response to these issues. You can kind of see this little tiny fence and this vast, beautiful landscape of the Greater Chacro region and Counselor area in Daneta, Four Corners area. And this was the site of a fracking spill, or tens of millions of gallons of fracking fluid broke. It was a long time before the community was notified. And there's people that live here. The methane in the air is overwhelming, and there's a lot of illness and harm that is happening to the people who this is their daily reality. Same as us living adjacent to these labs. That's just to say, like, that's the production, and there's the mining communities that are impacts. And so nothing is in silo. So we can't think of farming and agriculture as being in a silo either. And we made mycelium hands and put them in a wattle and planted some plantings. It was just a really beautiful act of love and hope. That was where we did a lot of community education. It's just a drop of love in a very abused landscape. There's this continuance of how we share seeds and food with each other in our communities as land-based peoples. We're not that removed from when we had that agrarian existence. There's so many amazing seeds in our community that have been part of these lands for thousands of years and part of us. And so we have our exchanges, in the spring. I know we're all looking forward to those that kind of ground us in the seasonal ways of being and that natural time and that way of sharing life with each other. And so, the seed library was a secondary project of the Healing Foods Oasis. A lot of donations from local farmers. Some of the seeds are grown out at the garden as well that are harvested. A lot of youth work incorporated in the development of this library. And with another colleague, Emily Erison, they repurposed the old card catalog, and you'll be talking about these beautiful seed libraries. And so again, just to kind of reiterate that the same things that make us vulnerable as land-based peoples are also our strengths. It's going to make our bodies strong and resilient in the face of these things. The more we can return to our full relations with these seeds and the plants and foods that they give us, that we can work towards healing our mind, bodies, and spirits when our waters are returned to us and are made pristine, when our lands are returned to us and made pristine, because Indigenous peoples are a living part of our ecologies. A scholar from my community, Dr. Greg Cajete, if you can read his books, he talks about Native peoples as an indicator species for the environment. And so you can gauge the health of the land by the health of the Indigenous peoples of that place. Are they still there? Are they somewhere else? And guarantee if one's not doing well, the other's not doing too well. Do they have access to the lands? Is there toxic industry set up in those lands? That we have these relations and ways of knowing that can help us and that we can help each other to clean the toxins from our environment. And again, like the remediation processes, it's not just like this mycelium by itself, it's helping our natural systems as a whole is what's going to heal. And it means stopping the harm at its source. It's not putting band-aids of like remediative restorative practices. It's like, where are we going to work towards abolition of these harmful things that are not life affirming, that are not what we want to pass on to our children. And this is how we nurture beloved community with all our relations. And so talking about seed sovereignty, I've been really blessed to be a part of this group, the New Mexico Food and Seed Sovereignty Alliance. And it's made up of the New Mexico Acequia Association, Traditional Native American Farmers Association, Honor Our Pueblo Existence, Tewa Women United, Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute, and Breath of My Heart Birthplace, and also Miguel Santisteban, who had a nonprofit called Aire. He made this beautiful video reading the Food and Seed Sovereignty Declaration that was put forth originally by NMA and TANAFA, and then further developed with the orgs that I mentioned. And so I don't think we'll watch this now for the sake of time, but it's on YouTube. You can look it up and watch it. It's amazing because this declaration has been signed by the All Pueblo Council of Governors in New Mexico, this resolution in support of this declaration, by the 8 Northern Pueblo Councils in New Mexico, Rio Arriba County, Santa Fe County, Española, City of Española, City of Santa Fe. There's a state house memorial in support of it. It's been used in the National Congress of American Indians, and it's gone global to give language to other seed sovereignty declarations at the UN level, in other countries. And so this is open source wording. You can go in your communities and advocate for these resolutions to pass where you are, and protecting our seeds from GMOs and being contaminated in that way, and protecting the integrity of Indigenous cultural knowledge and living relations. And we have had those threats. We've had to mobilize as farmers and work to advocate for harmful laws that have been tried to get passed here in New Mexico. They're seed preemption laws. That is when the state has control over what seeds are grown. And we're surrounded by states that have already passed seed preemption laws. So research the laws in your state, what things need to get repealed and changed, so that we have that self-determination around our seeds and around protecting traditional heirloom seeds of place that are so precious and are the key to our survival. And Part of our seed sovereignty is also being in relation with our Indigenous relatives globally. We've been working with our Mayan relatives to the south, who we've always traded seeds and food with, again, since time immemorial. That was how we took care of our seeds. We sent them out, we shared them, and so if something happened, we knew that somebody else would have them. They could adapt to the different areas and regions. And this is my favorite relative, Amaranth, one of my favorite relatives that I've been working with for a long time. It's a superfood. It's in a whole other, I could talk about amaranth for hours. And we grew seed at the Healing Foods Oasis that was gifted from Guatemala. This is the domestic variety that gets really big and abundant. We do have our native amaranth also to our region, the Hopi amaranth that has like the black seeds. They all have the same nutrition, same uses. This plant could end world hunger. It's growing in the middle of GMO cornfields, and they're calling it a superweed. And really, it's our plant relatives talking. It's one example of many of how nature is trying to communicate with us, you know, of like, hey, grow me instead. You know, look how strong I am. And it's an active resistance. Guarantee you that this plant is popping up in those fields and can't be killed by Roundup. Thank you very much. And so, you know, it's continuance, it's adaptability. This is a hybrid of the wild amaranth and the domesticated amaranth. So I'm experimenting with making these seeds dry land. Very different from genetic engineering. It's our ability to touch a seed from planting to growth to sustenance and giving that energetic exchange. And that's what we mean by being in relation. I mean, it's intergenerational knowledge, you know, from babies to elders. Just a reminder, like where humans exist is where water is where our land base is. And so I'd like to just close with a poem. It's about plants. Warmth and sunlight never cease, even as seasonal songs rain down in carefully measured cycles that only seeds remember completely, turning solar energy sentient and chlorophyll colors rainbow inner selves green, until the time of cold reveals always their colors. Perceptions of plants are limited in this human shell. A pulsating energetic world is contained in senses that are natured and nurtured, our shared multiversal life with beings older than us, and we struggle to imagine our relationship with them, resist the complete acceptance that our lives are dependent on their exhales and inhales. Breath is sacred, this we have learned over eons, is our greatest gratitude, our most humble offering, because it acknowledges this shared atmosphere and the eternity contained in biosphere. Elder teachings require human filters, senses used to make sense of limited human perceptions, personifying light and vibration, color and sound traveling on currents that light up into images we can understand. Flora knows us best as we walk and pray, those times we caress plant medicines with fringed hides and ribbon skirts, with soft leather soles or barefoot connections, and they always reveal which of their family we need for medicine when asked with respect, offerings, and recognition of their beingness. For who are we to name them male or female when they are clearly both and more, neither? To remake them in this image, branded with scientific names out of context of traditional teachings. Those first languages know their names and stories. It is a blessing to speak to elders in original tongues when it was they who gave us breath to exist. Green parent relatives whose medicine is given freely. Ancestral covenants must never be broken in order for our deep roots to honor the succession of seeds passed from hands to soil. The whisper of grasses as fingertips brush over pollen parts. Two spirit energies combining to make flowers, fruit, and our food. An interspecies interplay of real intimacy and relations, winged ones and two-leggeds, winds and animals, water and crawling creations, and even their own selves, as closed blossoms practice self-love, an open, willing act of replication to create seeds, clear purpose and reciprocity. Simple minds cannot understand it, as human spirit is constrained and our own tendrils search the limits of false boundaries. We can only learn how unconditional respect, love, and care has nothing to do with human definition or colonizer definition, controlled definition, but is made of song and spectrums of color. Infinite vibrations are the truth behind lies of futility. A gift freely given is pure exchange of energy. Medicines plucked from stems of kinship. All lives nurtured from simple acts of sweat and heat. Our bodies are beauty in these functions of truth. Honesty is the universal language that can pass through rectangular cell walls, and feelings find their place through openings in circular cells. Within the holiness of those confines, they exist in this time and space, communicating like always with patience for our limitations. Knowledge carriers and healers giving us life freely until we join them as part of our return. Perpetuity of creation, circles and squares, light and sound, wind and water, contained in vast complex bodies, much like our own external landscape, holding and accepting internal teachings of personal truths. So I'll stop there. I'm not sure how much time left we have, but happy to answer a few questions if time allows.
Thanks so much, Beata. That was really beautiful. So we have a question. I found out that heritage land raised seeds from my generational community are being sold in seed catalogs, including seed descriptions, romanticizing the history narrative of these seeds. These were seeds freely shared among community. What suggestions do you have for fighting this?
A lot of the simultaneous work that we have to do to abolish these systems of oppression, on Native peoples. And it really is the work of collaborators and allies to do the bulk of this labor for us. We're doing the work of maintaining our place as living parts of ecologies, and cultural appropriation is part of that system of colonization, of our food systems, that value of extraction from our communities, and wanting to appropriate it for themselves to kind of cement this final phases of colonization, which is to, for lack of better terms, like indigenize colonizers, to attempt to re-indigenize colonizers to a place when really there's no restoration without return to Indigenous peoples. And you can read the UN rights of Indigenous peoples, which our country didn't sign on to until 2013, something like that, where we were just now barely recognized as peoples. And in there, it talks about our rights to our cultural property, for lack of a better word, but I say cultural relations. And so it's up to society to uphold that recognition. And that's the thing, like if you're caregiving seeds, do the people of that place have access to them first and foremost before you're making a profit, before those are being put out there? So it's got to be a collective movement. And yeah, it's sad when our own peoples are not healthy and well, and it's just exoticized and romanticized, and everything you're mentioning.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Dana. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Their question is, what was the name of the person doing the research on the relation between Indigenous health and land health?
Dr. Greg Kha'p'o, and he has a book called A People's Ecology, I think is where he talks about that.
Thank you. I've seen a few questions about resources being shared afterwards. Yes, the resources, the recording links will all be shared via email with you. A question from Rosa. How can people best support the land back movement?
Aligning yourself with the values, Indigenous values of place. Really reflecting on what it is to be a guest and a neighbor. To restore management of public lands to Native peoples, to restore the pristine nature of lands to itself, to themselves. There's so many movements you can look into: land tax, land back. Look up the land back movement, which is not just about land. We're working to get seeds back, water back, birthing back. It's all of those things, language, all of those things are encompassed. So any efforts to restore those things as part of that movement. Inheritance funds to, like, my tribe had to raise like millions of dollars to buy back land from the federal government, which is atrocious to me, that considering it was stolen. So there's all those things that we could divert resources to. Abolishing these industries that are causing harm to our lands.
Yeah, thank you for that guidance. I have a question. What does sobriety have to play within this way of life?
I think it's very much connected, you know, like when I mentioned the garden is the intersection for all of the social justice issues. And, you know, addictions are part of the symptoms of the oppression that we face in our Indigenous land-based BIPOC communities. And when I started first experiencing the rumblings from detonations up at the labs, all those connections flashed in my mind with the alcoholism in my own family, the addictions that I struggled with when I was younger. And I attribute it all to that original violence of militarism, occupying our sacred sites where we would go to pray, of this attempt, because colonization is really an attempt to disconnect people from their lands. It hasn't been completely successful. But really it's a struggle for connection to community, to health, to these ways of knowing, to our spiritual and cultural strengths, which has been a continuance. It's not, you know, it's not like it's gone away. And for whatever reasons, that's been disrupted. And you know, like we talk about seeds, we talk about pregnant families. We're still reeling from 5 generations of residential boarding schools where our seeds were taken from us. That was the last time our seeds were taken from us, our children. And look what happened. And so those things are connected to the symptoms that we have to face and we're trying to heal from.
We have a question. Is there more information about the mycology projects y'all implemented? I would love to learn more and share with others experiencing environmental racism.
Absolutely, yeah. There's if you go to Tewa Women United's website and their environmental justice program tab, there's a resource that Caitlin and I put together about the projects. There's links to the workshops we've done on Zoom, a lot of recordings. Also, the Institute for American Indian Arts has some videos of our workshops up. So yeah, let me know if you can't find them. Happy to send you a link, or maybe I can send some to Jessica to make it easier.
Sure, yeah, and we can include, I know we didn't get to show the YouTube video that you had in your presentation. We can link for that too.
Yeah, let's watch the Seed Sovereignty Declaration.
We have a question. How do I advocate for local seed determination? You mentioned state laws interfering. What would the best channel to go through to start be?
I think passing similar resolutions in your community on food and seed sovereignty and honoring the first peoples of place, building meaningful relations with those first people over long periods of time, helping to uplift the work they're doing. Sorry, my cat's crying at my door. You can hear. But anyway, and then really, if you're into legislative work and advocacy, you got to keep an eye on these things. Look at the seed laws that have been passed. The USDA is researching lots of GMOs even in our region. And so how do we enact GMO-free zones in our communities? It's a huge issue and it needs to be done yesterday. But it's big movement and it has to be Indigenous led. That's the piece. You can't appropriate that movement because Indigenous peoples are those ecologies. So really looking at Indigenous led community grassroots movements and protecting our seeds, land, air, and water as a whole.
We've had a few questions about if you like do tours or speaking engagements throughout the US, not just on Zoom.
Mm.
Are you open to that?
I used to pre-pandemic. I like Zoom for those things these days, to be honest. But yeah, I'm open to doing that. But yeah, I've visited some seed libraries, and we got a lot of inspiration for our seed library from visiting other seed libraries. But it's awesome, and there's so many Native peoples doing this work. Like, I'm not the only one. There's hundreds. So I guarantee you can find somebody in your area.
That's really great advice. Another question is, how can folks get in touch with you?
You can find me at Breath of My Heart, Birthplace in Española. You can find my contact info and everything on there.
Okay. Great. Well, I think that is the last question that I've seen. Thank you so much, Beata. It was a really powerful keynote that you shared with us. And I've personally appreciated it. And I've seen so many appreciative comments in the chat too.
Kuntawaha, everyone. Thank you, and thanks for all the work you do and just giving love and care to our seed relatives, and with intention and really centering. Think about Navatoijia as you go about these workshops, and it's okay to be critical and call each other in if there's gaps in the work. That's how we move forward. That's how we get stronger together. So don't shy away from these hard conversations about these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you.